Welcome to Bloomberg Markets Asia. I'm Heidi Stroud-Watts, and there you have it. We've just watched the Democratic nomination for president go to Kamala Harris, the U.S. Vice President, formally accepting that nomination. It culminated in the evening with 100,000 red, white and blue balloons and the sounds of Beyonce's Freedom. We did at one point have a rumor that we were going to see Beyonce this evening, but that didn't materialize. Still, though, it was such a buoyant evening. And what an interesting speech that we heard from the VP too, right? She started out by really sort of wanting to give viewers and listeners a sense of herself, her upbringing, her sort of origins as a daughter of immigrants and how that shaped her career, her prosecutorial profession, and then all the way to the White House. I thought most interestingly was what she had to say about the ongoing war in Gaza, right? Really strident about Israel's right to defend and the US support of that, but also making these very strong remarks about how heartbreaking the humanitarian situation was.
Absolutely, Heidi. But I think what also stuck out was how this was a very policy-light kind of speech, more of a vibe check, as experts have already said this was going to be, as she tries to establish herself in the minds of American voters. Although theoretically, as 3.5 years of vice president, it should have already an impact on the minds of voters. So I think part of this is also how, for Democrats, is the strategy in which they're trying to prevent the pitting of the factions against each other, right? On one hand, you have the more progressive side that wants to take on big pharma, big tech, and on the other side, the really pro-business faction. So in a way, I think they're towing the line and trying to avoid some of these conflicts, as we don't have all these details yet, exactly what Kamala's policies are really going to look like. And don't forget, she also hasn't sat down for a one-on-one interview. That's something that we're really watching out for as well.
As you say, a lot of the sort of broad thematics that we were expecting, a couple of interesting moments, but really we're still waiting to see for some more details. But also interestingly, she kept her speech pretty tight, right? 39 minutes, less than half of what we heard from Donald Trump. But take a listen to some of what we heard.
I accept your nomination to be President of the United States of America.
Let's bring up Bloomberg TV anchor Vonnie Quinn, who joins us from Washington right now. And Vonnie, we're sort of still digesting what we heard from Kamala Harris. And certainly there is a sense of this sort of like reintroduction, even though she has been the vice president. Was there anything that was surprising to you at all?
That was a poised Attorney General that you saw on the stage there, Heidi. This is the first time that she's had this kind of opportunity. You get very different kinds of opportunities as Vice President. You're almost supposed to be a little bit in the background, in the shadows. This was Kamala Harris taking the full stage tonight. And she went through the speech detail by detail. As you said, she gave us a lot of her biography, some very touching moments about her young friend who had a traumatic experience, which then caused Kamala to want to protect people and go into a career in law. And then her line that she had used 5 words every morning going into her job, Kamala Harris for the people. That's what you say when you go into court. That went down very well in the crowd. She said that that would be her line from now on, were she to be elected. And she contrasted it a little bit later on, saying that while she had only one client, the people, Donald Trump had only one client, but that was himself. So she did definitely go into some details of her policy, but she also talked about how dangerous it would be, in her view, to re-elect President Donald Trump once again. She said in many ways Donald Trump is an unserious man, but the consequences of putting him back in the White House are extremely serious. Imagine a Donald Trump with no guardrails. And again, some of the bigger, broader themes for the DNC were sort of this retaking of patriotism for the Democrats. And also tonight, an interesting concentration on national security. She wants to be the US's commander-in-chief. She has 75 days to prove it. She can.
Bloomberg TV anchor Vonnie Quinn there, just covering some of the themes that we heard from Kamala Harris as she formally accepted the Democratic nomination for president. Coming up, we're also watching the Bank of Japan governor. Rate hike still on the table. Taking a look at the market reaction next.
been the honor of my lifetime to serve as your president. I love the job, but I love my country more.
We refused to give up on America. Millions marched, many ran for office. We kept our eyes on the future. Well, my friends, the future is here.
Here's a 78-year-old billionaire who has not stopped whining about his problems since he rode down his golden escalator 9 years ago.
I want to know, who's going to tell him that the job he's currently seeking might just be one of those black jobs?
More than anything else, let us choose freedom. Why? Because that's the best of America. We're all Americans, and together, let's all choose Kamala Harris.
It's the fourth quarter. We're down a field goal, but we're on offense and we've got the ball. We're driving down the field. And boy, do we have the right team.
Some prominent Democrats appearing this week to stump for Kamala Harris's election prospects. And Avro, it's been some of the greatest hits, right? We've certainly heard from some great orators, the Obamas obviously being the standout. But when it comes to what we heard from Kamala Harris earlier, it was really this sort of focus on lifting the middle class, right? Cutting taxes, talking about the dangers of some of, the trade policies and economic policies being touted by the former President Trump and what they would potentially mean for U.S. households. Take a listen.
I promise to be a president for all Americans. You can always trust me to put country above party and self, to hold sacred America's fundamental principles, from the rule of law to free and fair elections to the peaceful transfer of power.
Hearing there from Kamala Harris, and it's really that underscoring of the message that we've been hearing from Democrats all of this week, what a Trump presidency would look like, me, versus us. That is the message that Democrats have been touting all of this week. But of course, we also want to take a look at how markets are faring. There is a lot to digest here, Heidi. I mean, in the lead up to Powell at Jackson Hole, we already saw investors kind of paring back some of their bets of how aggressive easing we will ultimately get from the Federal Reserve. Powell could go on to signal the start of rate cuts, but at a rate that is much more gradual than markets anticipate. For now, we're seeing U.S. futures stocks on the S&P 500, NASDAQ, the futures pointing to a bright start at the open, a bit of a reversal from yesterday's declines. Look at where the 10-year is sitting as well. But of course, you're seeing how the dollar is sliding once again, flip the board, and I think you'll get a clue as to why. After Ueda today didn't come through with any dovishness. In fact, it seems like he's doubling down, if anything, on that hawkish messaging following his rate hike in late July, which really spooked the markets. We're seeing dollar-yen also hovering at around the 145.6 level. There is a lot to talk through, so let's bring in our next guest, Teck Ling Tan, APEC FX and macro strategist at UBS Wealth Management. Teck, we have Kamala, we have Powell, we have Ueda. So let's start with the BOJ governor. What was your key takeaway from what he had to say today?
Yeah, thanks, April. I think, as you mentioned, it was almost a feeling of insistence that he's doing the right thing. And I think for good reasons, but to the extent only that they are behind the curve, right? So I think it is perfectly sensible for him to lay out the path that there is more tightening to come. But I think obviously he is unable to ignore the fact that the market didn't actually take it very well when he actually surprised the market on the hawkish side on the 31st of July. So I think as much as he lays the path forward that normalization is part of the way forward, I do think they are cautious by nature. The fact that they are likely to hike by 25 basis points, maybe at the end of this year, followed by another one next year, I don't think that is a big deal. to the extent that it is actually quite expected by the markets right now.
And he himself is also underscoring that, they are far below the neutral rate. So it gives you a sense that they can tolerate whatever hike we see or tightening we see going forward. What is this going to mean for the Japanese currency? Are we going to see much further appreciation, keeping in mind what we get from Powell at Jackson Hole as well?
Yeah, I think the Bank of Japan would not be the major driver for the dollar yen. I think what is more important would be the state of the U.S. economic dynamics. I don't think Powell will be a surprise to the extent that he would be quite happy to claim a bit of victory with the data he's getting, the labor market cooling, etc. He would be non-committal, but I think the path is pretty set for the Fed to start cutting from September. Now, if according to our expectation that the US is actually going into a soft landing scenario, it would be a fairly gradual and steady path of rate cuts. And what it means for the dollar exchange rate is that we are aiming for a 140 by the middle of next year. And that is actually quite an orderly process, unlike what we saw a very sharp move in the past 4 to 6 weeks.
Tek, you can't blame Governor Ueda for defending his positioning, right? He kind of has to say that if economic conditions warrant it, then they continue on their path for credibility. Do you think markets sort of understand this, or do you think we'll see that messy unwinding again if we see too much of a jump in the yen? Because we have seen essentially all carry trades stage of recovery.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, he would have to balance it between trying to sound too hawkish versus the market reaction. So I think it really depends on the context. Today in Parliament, I think he has to defend his position. I think that is not a surprise. But to your point, whether we are getting another route unwinding, I wouldn't say so. Because firstly, we know from data perspective that the liquidation of the yen shorts have been more or less cleared on the leverage FX trading side. But of course, what is not yet unwound will be the yen loans that actually take time, because as we saw back in 2007 to 2009, the process of unwinding yen loan is actually a multi-quarter process, and that has to come hand in hand with the pace of Fed rate cuts as well. So what I'm trying to say is that the first part of yen carry trade unwind is over. The next step of the yen carry trade unwind, which is more the real money side of things, it would actually be a more gradual process.
Is there more concern about volatility sparked by Fed Chair Powell, potentially his comments, but also the state of the US fiscal situation, right? We just heard from the Democratic nominee, Kamala Harris, and we know that there's fiscal risks to the upside for inflation and growth, regardless of who wins in November.
Yeah, that's right. I think that is also part of the reason why we don't think a recession or hard landing is likely, because actually, as far as the fiscal spending is concerned, the amount of stimulus is still pretty sizable. And that is where I think it is trying to balance between not spending too much and achieving a soft landing. So I think as long as we do get a soft landing scenario, what would be dominant in the FX market is that the dollar would be able to weaken. And at the same time, risk sentiment can actually stay pretty buoyant. And that is actually where we believe that the best currencies to position in against a weaker dollar would be the cyclical currencies such as the euro, the pound, the Australian dollar, for example.
Tek, you prefer the Swiss currency to the euro as well. Why? I mean, we've seen the way the euro has been rallying this month.
Yeah, I think the Swiss is a bit of a sweet spot, I would have to say, because at the same time where it gives us a bit of a hedging quality, given the geopolitics risks in front of us, it also has the ability to withstand a potential Trump victory. That's one. The second point is that if you look at the central bank policy rate action, we believe that there are just one cut left before they go neutral, while the other central banks, including the Fed, the ECB, they are actually still at the start of the Fed cut cycle, rate cut cycle, or in the middle of the cut cycle. So I think the Swiss franc is actually offering a good balance between a risk-off hedge as well as the yield differential moving in their favor.
You spoke about the Aussie dollar and also potentially some support for a range of commodities. Does that mean you see the sort of downside exposure to China's slowdown as being fairly limited?
Well, I would say that as far as China is concerned, growth should stabilize, even though we don't expect a strong rebound. And I think that is already not too bad for the Australian dollar per se. What we really like about the Australian dollar is the fact that it got hurt during the great yen carry trade unwinding. And it has brought us to fairly attractive levels, because if we go by the yield differential perspective, as far as the Australian dollar yields versus the US yields is concerned, the Australian dollar should actually be trading closer to 69 to 70 cents. So I think that gives us extra buffer. And the fact that the market is still net short the Aussie, it also gives us a bit of buffer. So I think it is actually a very good candidate to be betting on a risk-on US soft landing with the Fed rate cuts coming into play. The Australian dollar is one of the preferred currencies from that context.
On the balance of risks, what do you see as potentially being sort of outside risks developing as we head into the end of the year that could perhaps upend some of these expectations?
Yeah, I would say the front and center on our mind would be the likelihood of a US hard landing. Because that was precisely the market focus when the non-farm payroll turned out to be very disappointing. If we were to get a situation where the cracks in the system are bigger than just small cracks, I think that is the bigger risk. Apart from that, it would actually come from the Trump risk, whereby it could actually interrupt the process of a soft landing as well, to the extent that harsh trade tariffs is coming. It would actually be a bit more pointed towards China and the Asian region as compared to against the G10 side. So to conclude, I think the first risk on our mind would be the hard landing risk in the US. The second risk would be a potential Trump victory.
Tek, really great to have you with us. Tek Ling-Tan of UBS Wealth Management. Well, the Bank of Japan Governor Kazuo Ueda has told Japanese lawmakers that the central bank is still on a path toward higher interest rates. That's if inflation and economic data continue to match their forecasts. For more, let's bring our Japan economy and government editor, Paul Jackson, who's with us in Tokyo. So, Paul, I'm curious to see how you sort of deciphered this speech. It was a pretty fine balance, right? He kind of needs to defend his positioning for credibility purposes, but he also obviously wants to keep market volatility subdued so that they can keep tightening.
Yeah, that's right. I think this hearing was setting up to be a bit of a tightrope walk, not encouraging speculators either to jump on a hawkish view of rate hikes imminent, while at the same time not going in the other direction and getting to the view that the Bank of Japan wasn't going to take any policy moves for a long time. And I think Governor Ueda has been successful in turning this potential tightrope walk into more of a walk in the park. He's kind of making this into a bit of a non-event by just playing a very safe, cautious line while robustly sticking to the view that they are very much still on the path to rate hikes. And I think he's succeeded so far in keeping rate hikes on the table for later this year.
We also saw Suzuki kind of coming out and saying they haven't fully overcome deflation yet, though they seem to be making a lot of progress in that direction. I mean, I'm curious to know what your sense of the political pressure overall is going to be, especially given how we are headed into a political transition in Japan as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about it. Inflation has a political element here. It's been one of the national goals of Japan for more than a decade to generate inflation. And yet the Prime Minister, who's overseen, 2% inflation, has essentially lost his job. He's stepping down and is to be replaced. So there is a strong political element in this. And now I think that the finance minister's comment that we still, are in this risk of falling back into deflation is an indication that there's still the view that we don't want to declare the end of deflation, because that might give the BOJ the view that it's got carte blanche to hike rates and go at the pace it likes. So I think it's a way of the politicians just keeping a brake on the Bank of Japan for now. But of course, depending on who the new leader of Japan turns out to be, that will change the optics for the Bank of Japan about how fast it can proceed with rate hikes.
Japan economy and government editor Paul Jackson there in Tokyo. Well, that decision to hike from the BOJ blew up that yen-centered carry trade. Now, as the dust settles, investors and Japanese business owners alike are questioning the currency's role in the global economy.
A single summertime decision by Japan's central bank ended up triggering a panic. And at the heart of all this, the Japanese yen and a massive global unwinding of the so-called carry trade. So what are carry trades, and why are they contributing to volatility in financial markets? In short, they're a popular strategy of borrowing currency at a very low rate of interest, the yen in this case, and investing it in something that pays you a higher rate. Now, you might make a return from that trade because it's kind of like investing free money. But
if things go incredibly wrong, you'll lose money both on the stock side, and then you have to pay back your credit company as well.
Which is exactly what happened in August.
And it all culminated in the Great Unwind, as we call it today. The yen, which everyone had been selling to fund this carry trade, surged in value. All of a sudden, at the same time, people started selling everything that they had in order to cover those margin calls. They had to pay for their losses somehow.
So what we've seen during this market crash basically is that what Japan does, what the Bank of Japan does, can have major implications for the rest of the world.
Subscribers can see that report in full on the terminal or at Bloomberg.com. It'll also be up on the Bloomberg Originals YouTube channel a little later. Still ahead, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi heading to Ukraine after facing a backlash for his high-profile visit to Russia last month. We're discussing his agenda next. This is Bloomberg. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has reinforced his message that the war in Ukraine can only be resolved diplomatically. That's ahead of his first visit to Kyiv since Russia's invasion in 2022. For more, let's bring in our government reporter, Sudhi Ranjan Sen, who joins us out of New Delhi. So, Sudhi, why the timing, I guess, that we see Modi visiting Ukraine now?
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting question because very clearly India is trying to balance its relationship with Russia and with US. Russia, of course, is an old, ally, old ties dating back, decades into the Cold War. United States, a newfound partner, India is trying to woo. At the same point of time, US looking at India as well as a bulwark, so to say, against China. So Modi's visit, of course, is to balance these two. I mean, we have reported, my colleagues and myself, we have reported about how the Russia trip kind of created a lot of frustration in the Biden administration, to the extent that there were calls made to the highest levels, asking or seeking clarity about why the visit went through. So it's clearly balancing the ties, trying to send out a message that India is basically, doing what it says, which is like, let's talk, let's diplomacy take over, and war is not going to solve the problems.
Sudhi, even as he tries to balance Russia and the West, the sense you get is that he's more of a messenger than a mediator. I mean, what realistically is he hoping to achieve then?
Well, there are a couple of things in this, while, he's trying to, Modi is trying to balance India's relationship. The other interesting thing that Modi is trying to do in this is basically open up India's relationship and outreach to Central Europe. traditionally Central Europe has not been very high up on India's foreign policy. India's Europe policy or Europe outlook has been largely limited to the United Kingdom, Britain, United Kingdom, Germany and France, and these are the countries that India has largely dealt with. Now, of course, with the Ukraine war kind of changing a lot of dynamics even within Europe, Modi is kind of trying to open up, widen up the outreach to Central European countries. And it is not only because, there is possibility of greater trade and commerce, but also trying to kind of signal that, India is looking out for more allies in that region.
Government reporter Sudhir Ranjan Sen there in New Delhi. Take a look at how Indian markets are trading so far in the early part of the session. We have seen really kind of this pause to the momentum. The Nifty 50, for example, had been trading higher for 6 straight sessions, and valuations, we are still pretty close to record highs, so just short of the past peak, as we see perhaps a little bit of a pause to the global stock rally, of course, going into Jackson Hole. Some of the commentary from the Bank of Japan as well, weighing more regionally. We're seeing the Sensex looking pretty flat at the moment, really across the board. Banks faring a little bit worse, about 0.2%. We have seen really these expectations when it comes to how much of a rise we could see in the Sensex past 117,000 on the back of growth expectations of at least 7% over the longer term. That's a compounded annual rate. So we could see actually further unprecedented levels for Indian equities, even as they still sit at these very high levels. If you're just joining us now, our top story over the past hour has been seeing Kamala Harris, the U.S. Vice President, formally accepting the Democratic presidential nomination at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. And we have really heard, as you said earlier, perhaps heavy on the vibes, light on the specifics, and perhaps intentionally so, as Kamala Harris really wants to avoid pitting factions within the Democratic Party against each other. Of course, we've really seen everyone from, disenchanted moderates to party hopefuls really being drawn back in ever since we saw that leadership swap. And it's quite interesting. That was only a month ago that we saw President Joe Biden stepping down as the candidate, Kamala Harris hurriedly sort of taking over. And the sheer momentum that we've seen has been really quite impressive. But take a listen to what Kamala Harris had to say in terms of her opponent.
Dictators like Kim Jong-un who are rooting for Trump. Because, they know he is easy to manipulate with flattery and favors. They know Trump won't hold autocrats accountable because he wants to be an autocrat himself.
A lot going on when it comes to market distractions as we head into the end of this week, going into Jackson Hole, of course, the economic symposium, but also hearing from Governor Ueda. Take a look at the yen continue to see really clinging on to that strength after we did hear from the Bank of Japan governor, really defending his decision to tighten and indicating that rates can go higher in Japan. More to come if inflation rises as the BOJ forecasts, and that it's better for long-term yields to move more freely. This is Bloomberg.